Hello and welcome to another video review of a game that I didn't necessarily know I'd be reviewing because I thought I'd lost the copy I had of it. But turns out I found it, so here you go. I bet most of you don't even remember this thing existed, but this is Mad Dog McCree, the original version released in arcades in 1990, and the DOS version that you're seeing here was released in 1992. It also saw release on CD-based consoles of the era like the CDI and the Sega CD and the 3DO, but it was also re-released many years later on other systems, which is kind of interesting. The sequel, Mad Dog 2: The Lost Gold, actually received the same treatment. It was originally released in arcades in 1992, but it actually got released on the CD consoles of the era first in 1994, and it later got released on PC in 1996. But since then, it has been re-released on other systems as well as a DVD release, so it's actually kind of interesting the amount of longevity this series has had, even though it's only 2 games, and neither of them were particularly well received in their day. I mean, to give you an idea, the original Mad Dog McCree actually got a 4% from PC Gamer. That's just impressive. I didn't even know that the scores could go that low for them, but apparently they found it that terrible. They actually also gave Mad Dog 2 a 9%, so it is apparently better, but that's not saying much. At least that was according to PC Gamer at the time, so that of course begs the question of what these games actually are. I mean, they're both light gun games. They're arcade shoot-em-ups that you would actually have a physical light gun to use in order to actually shoot the things on screen. It's the kind of game that actually works relatively well as an arcade title, but when you get down to it, arcades are practically extinct outside of Japan. And most gamers these days have absolutely no recollection of arcades if they were even around by the time they started gaming. And honestly, I pity those people because the arcade experience was something that is just unrivaled. Online multiplayer and LAN-based multiplayer have absolutely nothing on an arcade. It's a completely different feel. And that is something that is painfully obvious when you get into these particular games when you bring them to a home console or a PC. So let's go ahead and delve into these things and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's actually not much to talk about here. Both of them are FMV games. They have full motion video that has live actors playing the various characters, and they are rather low quality videos. And that's pretty normal for the era, but in the case of the original Mad Dog McCree, it actually becomes a pretty nasty problem, because the videos are actually so low quality that at times when they tell you to do certain things, you actually can't tell what you're supposed to shoot at. Such was the problem with being a CD-based FMV game in 1992. They just didn't have particularly high-quality video in those. And the sequel's really not much better. Now, admittedly, the version I have is the 2003 re-release that actually has slightly remastered video. So, in the case of Mad Dog 2, it is a lot easier to tell what you're supposed to be doing, but it is still rather low-quality video, and it is very low-res. The acting is pretty bad, and a lot of the scenes are just kind of baffling. For example, the moment in the first game where you rescue the sheriff, he goes, "Mad Dog, you don't stand a chance," and then he just twirls his revolver for no reason.
Mad Dog, you don't stand a chance. Let's go get him, stranger.
It's the kind of thing where you just sit there, pinch the bridge of your nose, and go, did he really just do that? And that sort of thing happens numerous times in both the original game and in the sequel, so it gets really cheesy sometimes, and that's kind of part of the charm, actually. These old light gun games in the arcades were not really meant to be taken seriously, and what you end up with here is a couple of really cheesy westerns. Pretty much all of the lines the characters are saying are pretty bad, because the acting is bad on top of the writing itself being bad. But here's the thing, in the first game it's kind of cheesy and charming, and the second game they tried to make it funny, and it doesn't work, and the lines end up being cringe-inducing. But at least there's plenty of bad acting to laugh at, like this one guy in this one scene who is clearly supposed to be dead, but instead he's clearly breathing. But beyond the bad acting and the cheesy dialogue and everything like that, there's really not much to the presentation of this. I mean, you've got some music, which is definitely fitting for the theme, but in the second game it's often outright awful, and in the first game it's just mediocre at best. Then of course there's the sound effects themselves, which are actually not terrible in the FMV sequences, but in the actual games they're fairly weak. The gun sounds are just not very powerful at all, and it ends up sounding really wimpy when you're shooting at things. Although in the first game you do have some really exaggerated grunting noises whenever somebody gets hit, so that's pretty amusing. And in the end, both Mad Dog McCree and Mad Dog 2: The Lost Gold are relics of their time as far as presentation goes. It's really not all that great, and there were certainly better looking light gun shooters out there at the time. But the real question becomes, what about the story and the gameplay? Well, the story in both of these games is outright minimal, and by minimal I mean in the first game, Mad Dog and his gang have taken over the town and it's up to you, the stranger, to stop them. And that's actually the entire story right there. In the sequel, you get to select one of 3 different characters to join with in an attempt to locate the lost gold, and to prevent Mad Dog from getting his hands on the treasure. Every single one of the characters in these games is a total stereotype, and it is played for laughs for the most part, but at the same time it is often pretty cringe-inducing. There is absolutely nothing complex to the storylines of either of these games, and the characters themselves are as shallow as the rest of them. So it really does fall to the gameplay to bring things up. What you've got here is a pretty standard light gun shooter. You shoot at the various enemies on screen, and you shoot off screen in order to reload your weapon. In the case of the second game, I know that the PC version actually has light gun support, but the issue is that modern TVs and monitors do not actually work with light guns. As far as light gun support goes on the first game on PC, though, I don't really know. I do know that on other systems it did have light gun support, and I do know that on more modern releases they did have some degree of support for certain peripherals. But the core gameplay loop is the same either way. You just shoot at enemies and hope you don't get hit. You have 3 lives to work with, and once those lives are out, you have to start the game all over again. Well, sort of. You can save the game and restore from the previous save, but that requires you to actually go into the menu in order to do that. And the second game is a bit more forgiving with the continues, at least in the 2003 version. I'm not entirely sure about the original DOS release. But you gotta keep in mind that these games were originally arcade titles that were designed to get as many quarters out of you as possible. This means that they are often difficult to a fault, where the difficulty is downright BS half the time. To give you an example, there are 2 guys who walk out to attack you on the corral stage. You can deal with them no problem, but then there's a 3rd guy who will almost always get you the first time. And that's because you quite simply can't see him. The only way for you to really know he's there is to see him actually shoot from that location, then you're like, oh, there's a guy there I need to take out. Similarly annoying are the frame timings, where there's only a certain window where you're actually able to shoot at certain enemies, and if you don't shoot within that window, you die instantly. And unfortunately, it's often impossible to know how long that window is and when that window is, except by simple trial and error. Even more irritating is that if you shoot multiple shots at them, then often it will not actually count any of those as hits, even if they are within the certain window. And I can't tell if that's by design or it's simply a glitch in the system, because it happens on both the original game and in the second game, and it's actually way worse in the second game. Now, I actually did not play these 2 specific games in the arcades. I only got to them after the fact in the home releases, so I don't really have that to compare it to. But I get the feeling that certain elements of, at the very least the second game, are really not that much of a problem in the arcade release, because the second game is running in Windows when you have the 2003 remaster, and it has a really nasty habit of losing focus on the window for some baffling reason. So that certainly doesn't help matters, but even when you factor in that some things are glitches, it's still pretty BS in its difficulty settings. Now, of course, if you play on the Deputy level, which is the easy mode, then the game is pretty easy for the most part, although there are still a few things here and there that will leave you absolutely astounded as to what actually happened. In numerous stages, you actually have to do things in a very specific order, which if you don't do them, then you die and you lose a life, which is really irritating. So it becomes a matter of trial and error, and even more irritating is when you do something and it turns out to be a trap that instantly kills you anyway. Even more annoying is when the game springs a duel on you, which is understandable. I mean, it is an element of westerns that you'd expect them to emulate, but the way they do it is you have to keep the gun off screen, in other words holstered, and then you actually have no ammunition. So if you forget to reload before quickly moving up and shooting at the enemy, then guess what? You lose a life, and if you're on your last life, then it's game over for you. But there is something redeeming about these games when you're talking about the home console and PC releases compared to the arcade versions. You don't have to spend more quarters in order to continue, you just start over or you just continue. But here's the thing, when you factor out the arcade environment and you factor out the need to put in more quarters to be able to continue, you actually find that the game ends up being very, very short. Going from start to finish, the original Mad Dog McCree is about 15 to 20 minutes long. The second game is also really short, but it is a bit longer than the original Mad Dog McCree, and it has 3 different story paths that you can go on depending on who you pick. But while that does provide some amount of replay value, it's really not a lot. I mean, you're talking maybe an hour to hour and a half of gameplay total for the second game. If even that, it really depends on how badly the game glitches out on your end. But that's the thing, a light gun shooter is really not designed for long periods of play. It's an arcade game that is meant to take a few quarters, you go in, you shoot a bunch of bad guys, and then you get out feeling good about yourself. You basically hope you get the highest score possible, and in the context of an arcade, that's perfectly fine. In the context of a home console or PC release, not so much. Because when you get down to it, the story is just awful, and the gameplay is very basic. It's a standard light gun shooter, and it plays like one, which means that it's really not a very deep game at all. And even the variances in storyline, depending on who you pick in the sequel, actually add some replay value. It's not really any different mechanically. But that's kind of how light gun shooters operate. Light gun shooters were definitely relics of the arcade. If you didn't play them in an arcade context, then they felt pretty shallow and they weren't really all that interesting. And the same is true here with the case of Mad Dog McCree and Mad Dog 2: The Lost Gold. If you get the chance to play them on an actual arcade machine, I'd say maybe give it a shot. But it's pretty much impossible for me to recommend the home console and PC releases simply by nature of the system just not working very well on a home console or PC. Which brings up a pretty important point about arcades. The experience really can't be replicated outside of the confines of the arcade, and certain arcade genres really do not work well outside of the arcades. Light gun shooters are one of those things, and Mad Dog McCree and Mad Dog 2 are absolutely no exception to that rule. Thanks for watching.